Welcome everybody to the do's and don'ts of mobile video downloading. You're probably thinking like I was that mobile video downloading probably isn't that important right now because we're all, or many of us, stuck at home working. But you know, the interesting thing for me, and I almost suggested we change the title of this, is that I find I'm using downloading more now than I was before. So I think this is very relevant. I can also tell you that one of the interesting things is that what the second biggest reason why people use downloads is to avoid buffering, to get a better quality. So I think you'll find that even though we're stuck at home, that people are still using video downloads where they have it available to them. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. The first thing I want to do is I want to introduce our panelists. My name is Colin Dixon. I'm founder and chief analyst at nScreenMedia. And we also have with us Will Richmond. He's editor and publisher of VideoNuze. Will is also my podcast partner. If you aren't tuning into our podcast, we hope you will. But that's Will. Welcome, Will.
Hi, everybody.
And also joining us is Joshua Presnell. He's Chief Technology Officer of Penthera. Welcome, Josh. And maybe you just want to give people a thumbnail of who Penthera is.
Sure. So Penthera is a mobile software startup that's specialized in improving the mobile video consumption experience for quite a few years now. We have major customers across the sort of expected spectrum of the players you'd sort of expect to hear.
Great. And Josh is joining us because he can give us a much more practical viewpoint on downloads than Will and I could give. So it's great to have him here. Now, during the podcast, during the webinar, excuse me, you can enter a question anytime you like. You're looking right there at the Q&A window. So just open that up, type your question in. We will try and fold that into the discussion, and we also have Q&A at the end. So if we don't get to it during the discussion, we will get to it at the Q&A at the end. And one other remark, there's a handout for this. You get a free report. We'll talk a little bit about that report during this presentation, but don't forget to download that before you head away from the podcast at the end. Now, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Will. He's going to tell us about what we're going to cover and do some scene setting for us, Will. I think we need some scene setting.
Okay, if you could turn the slide, Colin. So thanks everybody for joining us today, and hope everybody is staying well with the virus. Certainly, as Colin mentioned, upending everyone's lives these days. So we hope to provide some value to all of you on the topic of mobile video downloading. So our agenda today is to provide a little bit of context first on what is downloading and why is it important. Then we want to share some specific data from a recent report that Colin and I did studying 80 different video providers and what they're doing with downloading. Then Josh is going to provide 3 different use cases, as Colin said previously, to really get us low to the ground in terms of how downloading is being used and what some of the best practices are. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. Colin, if you could shift the slide.
I can. There you go.
So first, let's talk a little bit about why downloading matters. First, and probably most importantly, today when people subscribe to an SVOD service or even an advertising supported service, they expect mobility. So they don't expect that they're only going to be able to watch the video that they desire within their house or even on one particular screen. That's sort of the old days of pay TV where you had a set-top box and only those TVs that were connected with that with a set-top box were where you could watch. Now we all expect service mobility, watch wherever it is that we want to watch and on whatever device. The issue is that connectivity is far from guaranteed today. So if you've ever tried to watch video, stream video to your mobile device, you'll find that you may need to connect with a Wi-Fi hotspot and one may not be available, or if it's available, streaming may not be allowed. Or you may be in a setting where you're moving, whether it's on a train or a plane or a car, and there just is no guaranteed connectivity. So that leads to the viewing experience being very uncertain and also not guaranteed. And again, that compromises what users' expectations increasingly are. So there's really only one way to ensure availability, and that's by downloading video directly to mobile devices and essentially having a TV in your pocket. And that was actually the name of our report that we did that we're going to talk about in more detail throughout this webinar. But what we found is that consumers expect downloading capability. 59% of them say they do, and they also use it. And the graphic here shows that 54% of those that are able to use downloading actually do in fact use it across a variety of daily, weekly, monthly, and less than monthly times. You go ahead and flip, Colin. And in fact, 67% of people indicate that they would actually pay a premium for a downloading feature. So here we see a kind of a range of different amounts, anywhere from $1 to $2 per month, 23% reporting that, $3 to $4 per month, 34% saying that, and 20% saying that they would pay $5 or more per month for a downloading feature. So the takeaway from this slide is that there's actually probably a monetization opportunity, depending upon how downloading is implemented. There's probably a monetization opportunity for video service providers that allow this feature. Colin?
Yep.
So what we see in the report, that the research that Colin and I did, is that downloading is clearly being embraced, but it's not yet universal across the service providers that we researched. So the short answer here, if you look at the graphic, is that 28 or 35% of those that we looked at are offering some type of a video download capability, while 65% aren't. There are major services that are supporting downloading. Those include Amazon Prime Video, Apple TV+, CBS All Access, Disney+, Netflix, and lots of others that listeners no doubt will have heard of. But there are still major services that are not yet supporting downloading, or they have not yet announced support for it. So HBO Now is probably the most prominent of those services. Peacock has not yet launched, but they have not either. They also have not announced support for downloading when they do launch. Comedy Central is another service, and there are lots of others that are well known that also are not yet supporting downloading.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that HBO has not supported it. Well, I still find that jarring.
Yeah, I agree. It's even a little more jarring when you subscribe to HBO through Amazon Prime Video channels, and you're going back and forth between being able to download video from Amazon's own originals or licensed content, but then flip over to HBO and not be able to access it. So there are service inconsistencies now for sure. One thing that
HBO actually is a slightly more interesting use case too, because the way HBO is structured, you can get HBO downloads in Europe where you can't get HBO downloads in the US. So they've chosen for different strategic reasons to offer downloads in particular geographic regions.
Wow.
Right. That's interesting. And also we have the HBO Max launch coming up pretty soon. So it'll be an opportunity potentially for them to announce the downloading capability, but they haven't said anything yet. So we'll have to wait and see here in the US.
Yep. And
then finally, for my set of slides, what we found were that iOS and Android were really the most popular. 86% of the video services that did offer video downloads were focused on those two mobile operating platforms. Only 14% supported just iOS, and none supported just Android. And Josh, I think there's actually a small technical reason why there's a slight bias toward iOS, right?
Yeah, so I mean, the reason you'll find this is that iOS offers an extremely basic built-in downloading capability that's just part of the operating system. So it's relatively simple to do a very basic download feature just using the Apple offered tools, whereas Android doesn't have any of that. You essentially have to build anything you want to do with download from the ground up. So it means it's a more complex and difficult thing to build download on Android, but it's possible to do a very simple download on iOS without a lot of work. Now, obviously, the more complicated and more complex features you start adding, the more difficult it becomes, but that's why you'd see a graph that looks kind of like this.
Exactly. So, Colin, you want to take it away from here?
Yeah, sure. So I think we should get on with the do's and don'ts. That's the title of the webinar, and I'm going to give you a few of the do's and don'ts. Now, what I'm going to do here is as Will mentioned at the start, we basically tested for our report. We tested 80 different services, looking at their download functionality, and we tested across a suite of different tests. I think we did 10 or more tests on each download service to really get a benchmark of where we are. And you'll find lots more about that in the report. So definitely should grab that report. But I wanted to feature 3 things that I think are big differentiators, things that you can do, which I think can really help differentiate your service from the rest. So, and those are auto delete, download over Wi-Fi, restart after failure, very important, as we'll get to, and selectable quality, which is also very important in today's world. So let's get started and let's talk about one of my first do's, which is to support auto delete. Now, why does it matter? Well, auto delete, I mean, it doesn't sound like a big deal, right? And the basic services don't support it. And in fact, only 3 services support it in all of the services that we tested. But the reason it's so valuable to consumers is it really helps preserve valuable mobile device storage. I don't know about you, but I'm amazed. I think I've got 32 gig on my phone. I cannot believe that it's mostly full all the time. I am terrible at managing that storage. And I think the tools that the phones give you to manage the storage are really poor. So, at the time when you need to figure out, where you're using bandwidth, or where you're using storage, it's very often very difficult to figure out where it is. So providing automatic delete once a show is watched really takes care of that. That way a user can sort of mentally allocate a certain amount of bandwidth to storage of the videos from your service, and let you worry about managing staying within that constraint. Now, there's another thing that this pairs with, which I think is very important, and which would be a big differentiator, and that's subscription download. Now, subscription download is this idea that you can basically say, this show, keep giving me the latest 3 episodes. And the reason I say it pairs really well is when you download the next episode, you delete the previous one. So you keep the same amount of storage allocated on that device during, while the user is downloading and watching that particular show. And by the way, if you think that nobody really wants a subscription download feature, well, it turns out well over 2/3 of users. This is from a survey that Penthera actually did in the US. And they asked people, would you use a subscribe feature for their favorite show? And the answer is an overwhelming yes, they would. So a great way to differentiate yourself is by doing not only auto delete, but also to implement this subscription feature, which I think will be a huge differentiator for your service. And the reason it's huge is, look, only 3 of the services that we tested actually do this: Netflix, CBS All Access, and Sony Funimation, which was pretty shocking. Even Disney Plus, which launched recently, even Disney Plus doesn't do this. And they have a pretty advanced download facility for their users. So anyway, supporting auto delete, a big do if you want to differentiate your service. Okay, so let's jump to my second big do, which is to support download over Wi-Fi, but also restart after failure. Now, I mentioned that I already mentioned that consumers are very concerned about, difficult to manage your storage on your device. It's also very difficult to manage the amount of mobile data you're using. And most of us are living with mobile data caps, and some of us are even living with broadband data caps as well. If we can, one of the best ways to help people manage is to allow them to prevent download unless you're connected to Wi-Fi. So that's a great feature, and many of us use that. But I mentioned auto restart. Auto restart is really important here, because when you set something to download, it takes a period of time to come down. Many times I've forgotten that I was downloading, stuck my phone in my pocket and headed out the door. Now, if you don't auto restart when I come back within range of Wi-Fi, then I'm going to be very upset, right? Because when I do eventually decide I want to watch the show, it's not going to be there. So I think auto restart, certainly download over Wi-Fi, is a mandatory feature. Most services, we only found 3 services that didn't support it. Most services do support it, but the auto restart is equally as important, I think, so that when you come back in range, you really restart. And actually, this loops with what Josh was saying about iOS devices having very basic support for download. Look, Apple TV Plus, they did absolutely nothing extra. They just used the basic iOS facility. And most of the features that I'm talking about here are not supported by Apple TV Plus because it only uses that very basic iOS facility. Okay, so on to my third do, which is to support selectable quality. Now, I think selectable quality is important for a number of reasons. Certainly, the space constraint is a big reason why you might want to support this feature. Now, what you're looking at actually there is a little screenshot of this. I think this is Amazon Prime Video. And what you can do here is you can basically select from 4 different levels of quality. And actually what I have is I've selected, I think I select good on Amazon Prime Video for my downloads. And this has a number of benefits for users. One, it saves a great deal of space on the device, and we've already talked about that. 2, it actually downloads much faster because obviously the file that's coming down is much smaller. And there's a third benefit I just want to mention. As we all work from home, as we're all doing the shelter in place thing, a lot of pressure is being put on mobile and broadband data networks. And I think we should all be thinking about that and reducing our bandwidth usage where we can. And this is a very easy way to do it, by reducing the quality of the download to your mobile device. And I'm going to tell you, downloading at the best quality on a mobile device with a relatively small screen, I have a Pixel 3 with a 5.5-inch screen, and I'm using the good quality. It is perfectly fine on that screen. I love watching at that quality on my screen. I have no problem at all. So this is an area, this is something that you can do, get all of those benefits as a user, and really you don't lose anything at all by doing it. So and that's why it's such a big surprise that only about 1/3 of the services that we tested actually support this. So big surprise, and another area where I think you can really set your download service apart from just about everybody else out there. Okay, so those are 3 big do's that I think you absolutely should do. Let's talk about some don'ts. So the first thing is don't delay. I mean, Will's data, that shows pretty clearly consumers want this feature. They will use it if you give it to them. They appreciate having it. They value it so much, some of them will even pay for it. So there is really no reason not to implement a feature like download right now. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is it's table stakes. I think people just expect it. So we should do it. That's one reason. Don't feel you're limited just because you're ad supported. All of the services so far that have implemented it only in an SVOD mode. So even Hulu promised that they would provide download, and it took them a long time to provide it. And then they only provided it to the customers that are watching ad free. They didn't allow ad supported viewers to do it. And there are many, many reasons why you should, as an ad-supported provider, support downloads, not least of which consumers will use it, but it also gives you a footprint to reach your customer with an ad-supported product. In other words, make money where they currently cannot. So I think there's a lot of reasons why you should consider doing this. It is a little bit complicated, and maybe Josh can comment on that, but it's well worth doing. Josh, do you want to make a comment here, or is that something that you're covering in your use cases?
Sure. I mean, from a complication standpoint, yeah, one of the things that we say often in Penthera is it's relatively easy to do download simple. It's somewhat more difficult to do download right. So there's a lot of different things you need to consider and a lot of different variables and use cases and user experiences to think about. But really, at the end of the day, while there's a lot to consider, it's a relatively straightforward and well understood process at this point. And there are companies like Penthera that are out there in order to make that process more simple for you. So I don't think that people should be scared away by a thought of complexity. It's a well understood path that just requires some consideration as you walk down it.
Very good, very good. So okay, so my next don't ignore popular customer use cases. So spend time really thinking about how your customers will use this. And here's why. There are many different usage cases for downloads. So I'll give you an example. For example, say you're heading out on a trip and you want to fill up your device with videos to watch when you're on the plane and sat in your hotel room. And so you set a bunch of download. Great. And in the meantime, while you're waiting for your Uber to show up, whenever we get back to doing that sort of thing, of course, you're watching something on your phone. The Uber shows up, and so you need to leave, right? So you haven't finished watching that show, so you add that to your download list, and then you head out the door. Now you are going to be really upset when you get to the other end, or you're sitting in your Uber or something, and the rest of that show hasn't downloaded. So being able to change the priority of the downloads so that one goes first is, I think, a really important feature to support that particular use case. So and there are many such huge use cases. For example, you're chatting with, you've set your phone up so that you only download over Wi-Fi, and you're chatting with a friend at a Starbucks or something, and he says, oh, there's this great show. So you pull out your phone and you want to be able to queue that show in your service and then have it download when you get back in Wi-Fi range. So believe it or not, a lot of the services do not support that if you're set to Wi-Fi only. So you need to think about these use cases. Josh is going to go through some more, and make sure you really you figure out how your customers are going to use it and you support those use cases. Next is don't believe connectivity issues will go away. There's a lot of talk about 5G being the panacea for mobile data. And I got to tell you, they talked about 4G being the same. We still do not have in the United States, despite 4G being 15, 20 years old, we still don't have blanket coverage of 4G everywhere. I still go plenty of places where I can't get mobile data. So don't think the technology of connectivity is going to solve the problem for you. It won't, and it probably never will, and it certainly won't do any time in the very near future.
So,
And
Colin,
yeah, go ahead.
If I could step in just a little bit on that one. So 5G is one of those really fascinating topics. There's actually like 3 different flavors of 5G that are all considered technically 5G. The vanilla flavor is the one that's going to be seeing the most rollout, and it'll give us some improvements in speed, a lot more improvements on latency. So it'll be good overall for streaming, but not nearly the advantage that the promise of 5G was. The chocolate 5G is the one that everyone was excited about. That's going to be really, really fast, but that has a limitation of going only really, really short distances. So we're not going to see that in a lot of different places. Mostly we're going to see a very small vanilla step increase in terms of what we'll be able to do. And at the end of the day, every year video becomes a larger thing and a larger burden on the network. We're far outpacing consumption over the ability to move the data on the wire. So even as we roll out 5G, it's not going to be the great solution for download that some people have thought it is.
Indeed. So thanks for that, Josh. Yeah, definitely not. So my last point here is, don't make this process confusing. We found in our testing a number of the services, we'd set something up to download and we couldn't figure out how it was progressing, if it had started, if it had finished, how far through it was. In some cases, we couldn't even find where the downloaded shows were going to appear. So this can be very confusing process. Keep it simple. So right there, you have a service of Gaia. Their implementation, I thought, is very, very easy. You can go look at your queue. You can see what's in the queue. You can see what's completed downloading. Very, very easy to use. And that should be something that's in the forefront of your mind as you implement this feature. Make it, even though you can do the advanced features, and you should do the advanced features, always think about keeping it as simple as possible for your users. Okay, so that's the do's and the don'ts. I think you've heard enough from me. It's time we heard about some use cases. So I'm going to hand it over to Josh.
Thank you, Colin. So just kind of going through some places where people have historically gotten it right, some places where people have historically gotten it wrong. Wanted to take our first trip down memory lane to one of the first implementers of download as an accepted feature, Netflix. One of the things that they sort of had a bit of a mistake on initially when they were working with download is they fell into the trap of forgetting about permissions handling and how different user experiences with download might complicate business rules. So the particular case Netflix was working with is they had a contract requirement that said they had to limit the total number of downloads of any one video per year to 3 times. So a user can download it, consume it, have it until it expires. They can go and they download that same asset again. They can do that 3 times and then not allowed to have it anymore. Well, what they didn't think about was that when they incremented the download counter was when the user hit the download button. But what happens when I hit errors or I walk out of Wi-Fi range or I have something that pauses or stops that download from finishing? Well, what we learned is that if that happens, and I had it happen frequently when Netflix first launched download, is you're not allowed to ever actually view the downloaded content because Netflix has decided you got it 3 times, even though you never successfully downloaded it. So the lesson to be learned here is that there's a lot of things that play into the overall user experience, and you have to think about how that's going to work in a mobile environment to properly give your users access to the content that they really, really want to enjoy.
God, I can't tell you the number of times I've bumped into that download limit. It drives me crazy. Okay, so let's use case number 2.
Use case number 2. This actually goes back to 2015. Believe it or not, Amazon has had the ability to download video for a very long time. although it was primarily supported on their Kindle Fire devices, where they were working really hard to push these devices as media consumption services. So back when Amazon introduced the Kindle Fire 2, it came with a new feature they called On Deck, which was an automatic download feature long before Netflix released Smart Download. Now, what this system did is it used recommendations and artificial intelligence to figure out what it thought you might want to watch, and it would just fill up your device with all that content for you, so that whenever you wanted to go and play it, and maybe you'd have to pay for it in order to be able to play it, they would have it there on your device ready to consume both online and offline. Now, the problem here is that Amazon thought it was going to be such a great feature. They turned this on by default with no kind of system limits. And users quickly worked out that they were filling up their devices and not able to use that storage. Even though Amazon had said that once you bumped up and tried to use that storage, the device would automatically clear the video off to make room for it, it didn't work out quite that way. And so the disrespect for device resources led to a lot of upset users, a lot of forum posts, and a lot of people trying to figure out how to turn off a feature that Amazon really wanted to provide quality to their users. So the key lesson here is use business rules to avoid downloading when you shouldn't. Respect the cellular plans, battery levels, automatically remove downloads using expiry after they've been played in useful ways to make sure that you're not abusing what is a very precious resource on a user's mobile device.
So is that complicated because of all of the different devices that somebody runs on, Josh? That sounds like it could be problematic if you're implementing on iOS and Android and Roku and all sorts of other things. Is that
sure?
Does that complicate things?
And it can get even weirder when you're dealing with Android devices that have external storage, and combining that with potentially contract requirements that vary amongst providers as to what DRM can and can't be used on external storage, whether assets can even be downloaded to external storage, where a lot of the extra space on Android devices actually resides. So a lot of the download solutions you'll see out there will not allow videos to be saved into that external storage space, whereas in some cases we're allowed to do this. And then on iOS you have a similar problem in that there's a much wider range of available storage, whereas on Android you tend to find smaller devices are more prevalent in the market. That makes for some interesting business rules. So in a lot of cases, it's not enough to just say I can only download to 32 gigabytes of space. Well, what if I'm on a device that only has a 16 gigabyte drive? So having an upper limit that also respects don't ever write to the last 5 megabytes of store or 5 gigabytes of storage is also a useful business rule to use in order to respect the customer's devices.
Very good. Okay, so let's go to use case 3.
So we talked a couple of things that are probably a not good idea in terms of historical lessons learned. This is actually a positive, again, calling out Netflix, who tends to be a bit of an innovator in the space. So as far as we've seen, Netflix is the only provider offering an automatic download feature currently called Smart Download. It was initially released to much acclaim on iOS and soon followed on Android. And the way they drive the downloads is based on the user's own usage patterns. The interesting thing here is because Netflix generally drops all of their content all at once so that their customers can binge watch it, what they can do from an automatic download perspective is to follow the user's behavior of, well, I've downloaded 3 episodes of this. When I watch and delete the first one, I'm going to just go ahead and download the one next in line. So I always maintain 3 episodes that are downloaded waiting in line behind. This is useful when you have a catalog that's all presented up front, but it becomes more challenging when you have a catalog that's released little bits at a time, like most cable providers do. So the lesson learned here is that opt-in automatic download is a very powerful and differentiating feature. It's been very, very well received by the community and by the folks who use it on Netflix. But also, as a sort of a second lesson learned, services with catalogs that build over time need to be making use of a more complex feature to allow push download to be able to offer a competitive advantage there.
So how would I, if I'm not Netflix and I'm not dropping all the episodes on Disney and I'm dropping them, once a week or so, how should that opt-in work in that case?
So there's actually two really interesting use cases here. There's the concept of news, and then there's the concept of like TV series. And if you think about it, they're subtly different. So with the traditional concept of TV series, I want to watch the oldest stuff before I go and watch the newest stuff. And so maybe I'm going to play catch up for a little while, and I'm going to automatically download episodes 2, 3, 4 in the entire first season. Well, I go and I consume all of that. Well, when it's time for the next season to be released, if I've subscribed to have automatic downloads, when the system gets an update that season 2, episode 1 is now available, we can send a push out to that device that says, go download that now, so it's ready for the user when they come back to watch it. So that's how you'd mix push download with the automatic downloads to allow content to update itself over time.
Very good. So thank you, Josh, for those 3 excellent examples. Just a reminder, if you have questions, pop them in that Q&A window that's in front of you. And I think we're gonna do some conclusions, and then we're gonna get to your questions. So Will, why don't you wrap things up a little here so that we can talk about our listeners' questions.
Definitely. Thanks, Colin, and thanks, Josh. Appreciate all the information that you've shared. So again, from a conclusion standpoint, if it's not clear already, in terms of next steps, if you're a content provider, it's pretty clear to us that downloading is becoming table stakes and that it's going to be really important to be able to offer this to your subscribers or to your viewers. So a clear next step is to investigate and start getting moving on implementing this as a feature. And if you've already implemented it as a feature, look at it as a competitive differentiator, as a way to distinguish yourself from competing services. I think Joshua provided a number of different levels and looking at how sophistication can vary and what the best practices are. These can translate into competitive differentiation, and they can translate into monetization. So those are critical next steps. When we think about where the market is going, as we found in our report, today downloading is primarily oriented toward SVOD services, not AVOD services. But we think that that's poised to change going forward, because users are increasingly looking for free content. And there's been a lot of information about that and written about that. And to the extent that AVOD services are going to become more popular, we think the downloading capability within AVOD services is also going to become more popular. So that's a clear signal of where we think the market is going. That's not to say that SVOD services shouldn't be doing this also, but we think there's a heavy emphasis for AVOD. In terms of resources, there's a lot of good stuff out there. We certainly point you to the research that we did. That's the link there just below to be able to download the report. We think it's the first really comprehensive study that's been done of the biggest players in the market and how they're handling downloading, and also what some of the key features are, the best practices are, and who's really capitalizing on that right now. So in terms of really getting a full industry overview of where downloading stands today, I'd highly recommend the report. But there are lots of other resources out there as well. There's been a fair amount written about downloading. Penthera has issued a lot of interesting research, both domestically and internationally, about what different services are doing these days, and also where consumer behavior is. So with that, I think, Colin, we're going to wrap up the formal part of our webinar for today, and now open it up for audience Q&A, right?
You bet we are. And so just a reminder, enter your questions right there. And I think, well, one of the things that has definitely caught our listeners' ear the AVOD issues. So I wonder, maybe we could start with you here, Josh, and you can tell us a little bit more about the unique challenges of doing AVOD.
Sure. So AVOD is a very, very interesting animal, especially when it comes to the concept of download. And that's primarily because the way the advertising industry is set up to measure the consumption of advertising and therefore the when people get paid for the ad. So the way this works is there's these URLs that are called beacons that come with the video. And normally during streaming playback, as you play the ad, the player then triggers those beacons, which tells the ad server that someone should get paid for it. Well, when you're doing an offline download, and I've downloaded the content to a device, and that may or may not be played back for potentially weeks, the advertising systems aren't set up to properly be able to take those beacons back so far into the future. And so the trick there is being able to refresh advertisements over time so that it's not the advertising that you downloaded that you necessarily have to play when you play back the download. So we maintain a consistent cache of advertising that's ready to be played with the download that keeps the beacons a little more fresh so that they can be sent to the advertisers and people still get paid for the advertisements.
Yeah, and that of course deals with the situation where, well, maybe that's a slightly different situation where the ad becomes out of date.
Yep, and then what do you do when the ads go out of date? The idea behind the refresh principle is that you're going to have an ad that doesn't go out of date because you're always going to be getting new ones. But as we all know, that there's going to be use cases where I don't necessarily have network availability in order for that to function. Or I'm on a cruise ship for weeks and that's just not a possibility. So what do we do in those use cases is something that's being worked out with both the publishers and the advertisers.
Yuck, cruise ships. That's a kind of scary concept at the moment. Anyway, let's get on with the next question. So the question is, what are your thoughts on the impact of content providers have on services making downloading available? Who wants to kick off on this one?
Well, Colin, I can respond a little bit on that one. I think that we shared some data earlier that showed what percentage, more than half of people who are able to access downloading are doing so, and that there are expressions of interest by respondents that they'd actually pay more for a downloading feature. So from my perspective, I think that the impact is pretty clear, that it makes a service more competitive and potentially more profitable down the road, and that this downloading capability is increasingly becoming table stakes as the biggest video services in the industry not only adopt it, but they also tout it. So for instance, when Disney Plus did their launch announcement, the downloading capability was a marquee part of their product presentation that day. They were very proud of the downloading capability and spent a lot of time talking about it at the presentation. So to the extent that big, well-known players are making downloading table stakes, I think it's a signal to everybody else that they need to stay at least at parity, if not innovate further and try to achieve some competitive differentiation.
Yeah, Josh, you hinted in your use cases about some of the complexity. Some of the things I picked up on that you mentioned were things like content providers providing restrictions on location, where you can store, whether it's on an SD card or only in the device memory, the number of times something can be downloaded, and the length of time that it can remain downloaded. I have to admit, I bumped into, I think, every single one of these restrictions and found each time how irritating they can be. So are content providers loosening up these restrictions or not? Are we still seeing all of these restrictions in the contracts, and that's forcing more complexity onto things?
Well, I mean, I think it's more to say the content owners are the ones that are holding on to these. You know, in
Right.
general, the best practices have always been, from a content provider's perspective, is don't give them any restrictions. You know, you don't want people to have problems accessing their content. That's what they're paying for. But as we all know, whenever lawyers get involved, you get some really interesting requirements that come down the pike. And there's, you know, dozens more that we support that weren't in that list. Things like you can only have 3 devices on your account enabled for download at any given time, and you can only change whether a device is enabled or not for download once every 30 days is an example of another one. And those kinds of things become, you know, pervasive in different kinds of requirements with different download providers, different content owners. It all depends on who's negotiating the contracts for the content.
Indeed. Okay, so let's move on. Another question. What do you think the primary reasons are for the companies that have not yet added download to their mobile apps? What is their hesitation based on?
Ooh, well, I personally think that one's going to be extremely based on the individual company you're talking about. I can say that the general perspective of HBO in the US, for instance, is that they are primarily focused on the premium consumer who's sitting on a couch with a 65-inch HD screen as their primary audience member. And they don't feel that the mobile audience is necessarily one that's going to be a driver for them. Whereas HBO in Europe has the different perspective that there's a very driving demand for download, and that's something that they needed to offer. So I think it's a business perspective in some cases that is driving, you know, who is our primary audience that we're committed to. And there's others. I'm sure I'll let some of you others have a chance to answer as well.
Yeah, so I talk to D2C providers a lot, and several of them that I speak to, I know haven't implemented download, and I've asked them on why they haven't. Why, you know, I've talked to them about the data and how popular it is with consumers, and I can tell you right now, in almost all cases, they all want to do it, but it's just one of those things that their implementation teams haven't gotten around to. There are other more important things that they've had to address. I can tell you that also that one of the things that consumes providers, SVOD and AVOD providers the most is just keeping pace with the platforms that they're on. Those OSs, those video OSs are continually updating. They are trying to deliver new features into their applications aside from downloading. They keep that, you know, they have to deal with so many different versions. It's just logistically, it's very, very difficult, they feel, to add this sort of feature, and it just ends up percolating on in the priority list, which is somewhat odd, Josh, right? It must be I mean, it's very frustrating for our users to see it percolate down when it's something that we all want, right?
And it's actually a very good point, is that you know, most of the people who are involved in these content distribution companies are distributors primarily and aren't mobile software developers. And
Right.
the mobile software development space is one that evolves rather frequently and rather quickly. So to provide a good mobile software experience and a continually you know, market driven application that's meeting your customers' expectations, you need to be working on them constantly. And so prioritization of features then becomes a very tricky thing to do. And that's one of the reasons why you might want to come and, you know, consider working with a partner like Penthera for the features for download, because, you know, you're offloading the upkeep of that constantly evolving mobile feature to someone who's your partner in that process. But it is a lot to keep up with.
And Colin,
Right.
I would also add, I think the finite resources that both of you have mentioned is very valid. I've certainly heard that from providers in the market. I also think that there are some services that are concerned about rights and whether they have the rights to distribute their content, not just in streaming, but in downloading. And inevitably, there are concerns around DRM and people being hesitant about what type of can of worms could be opened on a DRM front. So I don't think any of these issues are insurmountable. In fact, I think that Netflix faced some of these exact issues in the early days. They, as Joshua, as you mentioned earlier, Amazon introduced the download feature very early. Netflix didn't follow until, I want to say, at least a year and a half or 2 years later. And my understanding is that they were grappling with some of those issues themselves, the rights issues, the DRM issues. I think there were some other things on the table for them as well. But Colin, to your point earlier, there are a lot of different claims on budget and resources in every company, especially when the market is growing fast and you're trying to serve a lot of different interests. So I just don't think we've gotten to an inflection point yet in downloading, but for all the reasons that we've mentioned today, it certainly should be coming soon.
Indeed. So I think we're getting close to being right out of time. We'll do a couple more questions, and then by the way, I urge you to download the report while you're still with us. One question came in about testing, which services provided the fastest downloads. Well, we did. So I can tell you we didn't test the download speed, and the reason we didn't test the download speed is simple. The variability, it was just too variable. There were too many variables there. So quality of the connection that we were on, and when we were doing the testing, the time of day, that it would change during the day. So that would vary things. And the device itself we were using, that would vary things. So there were just too many variables. So we ended up not testing which service, the fastest speeds for download, because we didn't feel like we could give a definitive measure of that. So I think we'll take one more. What do you think is, well, we already did that one. I should have marked that one. With regards to selectable quality, do you believe users can tell the difference between the quality level on a phone? So I sort of talked about that, but Josh, maybe you're dealing with this on a daily basis from a very technical viewpoint. Do you agree with what I was saying about the fact that it really is very difficult on a smaller screen to tell the difference between HD and SD? And
I think
how you handle that?
I think it depends a lot on the exact compression settings you're using and what algorithms are being used for the compression. The difference between like 720 SD and 1080p HD is something that if you're used to going back and forth, you can see it. But it's kind of like, talking about the sound quality back in the audiophile days and people arguing about whether this or that format of MP3 or ORG file gave you the best audio experience. At the end of the day, the reason that people offer options is because there are some of us who are really, really good at identifying, differences in black levels, and we want to see the higher quality video, and we can tell, or at least we think we can tell. And then there are those who don't care and will be okay on a standard or a default setting that's lower, and that's perfectly fine.
Very good. Will, have you been using different quality levels on your devices? What do you think?
I would definitely agree with Joshua. I don't think it's monolithic. Everyone has their own degrees of preferences and tolerances. I consume a lot of video on my iPad, and one thing I've noticed is that, to the extent that it's a program that includes a lot of darker or lower lit scenes, the quality seems to me to matter even less, because it's just harder for the human eye to be able to see the distinctions between quality level in lower light situations. So I tend to believe that it's less of an issue. Lower quality overall is probably acceptable to more people than that.
Very good, and I think we're just about out of time. So thank you, Will, thank you, Josh, for your good thoughts. Audience, we will send you'll get an email after the webinar, and that will include the presentation that you've seen today. It will give you the ability to download the report if you haven't already. And we'll get back to any other questions. We'll get back to those questioners directly that we haven't addressed in the podcast or in the webinar already. So thank you, everybody, for your time, and we will see you again soon.
Thanks, everybody.